So, you have all received, those of you who wrote one, a document with my feedback on your proposals. So these are posted on the migrated page. If you want me to send you the PDF directly, you're welcome to do so. Just give me a holler. The basic idea is that I tried to give you a response that corresponded to the scope of what you suggested in your proposal and offered some suggestions for research and additional information that you might need in order to approach the research essay, which I'll talk about in just a second. So we got a reading this week, The Death of Patroclus, and so we have the online discussion and quiz as usual. I'm looking forward to this week's discussion. It's a very significant reading in both the story that contains it, the Iliad, and the sort of cultural approach to how the Greeks understand that story. So the online discussion, we'll look forward to that, and quiz due on Sunday. Let's talk about the research essay. So this is a little bit different from the kind of research paper I normally assign for my classes, in that the emphasis for the research essay is on the work that you have chosen to focus on. The goal is to be able to say, have a thesis like, I believe that this work, whether it's the Gospel of Truth or Aristophanes' The Birds or whatever, I believe that this work shows us X about the way the culture that this comes from thought about the gods. And so the research aspect is to gain additional supporting evidence in conjunction with the evidence, the primary evidence that you have from the work that you're studying. If you're looking at the pumpkinification of Claudius, which was one of the options. The primary body of your paper is 3 moments from the pumpkinification of Claudius that give us insight into how the Romans of the early Principate thought about the gods. That's your primary through line for the paper. And then, in addition to that, you do a little extra research that bolsters what it is that you're trying to say. A little bit more information about the Romans, a little bit more information about the subject of the story, which is Claudius, a little bit more information about the author, which is Seneca. The point is that the bulk of your evidence, the bulk of your discussion is talking about the work you're studying. The research that I'm requiring you to do is to shore that up with additional information about the culture, the work, the author, or the subject. And so when I say that 3 sources are required, one of these is the work you're studying. And then additional primary or secondary sources. To back that up. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? So, this is what I'm looking for. And so the goal here is to the methodology here is to listen to what your author is saying. Leave behind your own assumptions about this time and place. Leave behind your modern ideas about how things should be, or what religion is about in our time, or what you're raised to believe. Think, sit yourself in a quiet room with this author speaking these words to you, and just listen. listen to these words. Don't read them. Listen to them. And think about what you would say. Think about the conversation you would have about what this author is raising in your mind, what this author is saying to his or her own audience back home. Place yourself in that room and just listen to what this author is trying to say and single out what he or she is telling you about the gods, about the divine world, about the cultic interchange, about the role of these stories in human culture. Remember the tripartite theory of religion, of the divine world. We have the cultic practice that connects them to us. And then we have the mythology and stories that hold human culture together. Think about that as you're listening to the story, and how what this person is telling us relates to all the things we've been studying. You're not just doing this paper in isolation. It's connected to all of these issues that we've been looking at. And so you can make reference to Johnston, because most of Johnston, the textbook for the course, is secondary discussion of primary information. You need to make sure that whatever passage you're looking at in Johnston is talking about primary sources. If it's discussing secondary sources, that's not as secondary itself. Somebody talking about secondary sources is tertiary, and you're not allowed to use tertiary sources. So if you have any questions about what works as a valid source, come and see me. But part of this process is to supplement your analysis of what the story is telling you with additional supporting evidence, either primary source evidence from the time or scholarly evidence about the culture, the subject, the author, or whatever. Make sense? Yeah? We're all ready to do this. We're all excited. I'm actually looking forward to this assignment because it's an opportunity to dig deep into one particular work, which often yields enthusiasm as people sink into it and start to connect with what it is that they're reading, what it is the author is trying to say. In terms of writing the paper itself, so on my website there is, on the resources page, there's something called the Elephant Pamphlet, which talks about how to approach a paper in which you're taking a position. And this is what we're doing here. The essay that you're writing is taking a position. I think that this work shows us X. A statement of opinion that someone could disagree with. And so I just had a testimonial in one of my other classes that said, he told the other students, use the Elephant Pamphlet, it really works for me. And so I'll just pass that along to you without comment. The essential structure that the Elephant Pamphlet talks about is something that is prevalent within academia, especially history, which is that you try to make an assertion and then provide 3 reasons why it's true. So you have an introduction that sets up the problem. And then, my apologies to those of you who have had me before and have seen these slides multiple times. You set up an introduction that puts forward the problem. Your problem is something along the lines of, what does this work tell us about religion? But you can try to make it more specific. Does this work, provide a consistent message? Is this work more about religion, or is it more about a social agenda? Does this work respect the gods or scorn them? try to frame your approach to the paper in the form of a question, which you then answer with a thesis. I believe that this work shows us X about, the Romans, the Greeks, and Hittites, or whatever it is you're talking about. And ideally, you would want to have 3 reasons why. I believe X because A, B, and C. Because this passage shows us ridiculous behavior, because this passage shows us a demeaning of a particular god, because this shows us that the primary action is rejection of a particular thing. Give 3 reasons why in your thesis, and then you've got a blueprint for the paper. Each section of your paper starts out with one of the reasons. You make an assertion. The work first shows scorn for the gods by showing Zeus, peeing on his subjects, and then you talk about the passage in which that happens, and then provide your analysis showing what that evidence tells us and how it fits in with your thesis. And then, your second assertion. This work shows scorn for the gods by having Apollo do armpit farts. And then you talk about the passage in which that happens and discuss what it means. Now, this discussion part is what's critical. What I'm most in need of for this essay is what it is that you are trying to say. And so, some people figure that all that they need to do is to provide a description of the evidence and then a one-sentence analysis. This shows us that the gods were angry. That's not analysis. Analysis is taking a new paragraph and talking about what elements are present in the evidence and what you think that they show us, and how it relates to your assertion, how it relates to your thesis. Your analysis in each section should be at least as long as your description of the evidence. So normally you would have your assertion and then a paragraph describing your evidence and a paragraph making your analysis. And then your second assertion, same thing, a paragraph describing your evidence, a paragraph providing your analysis and discussion. And then your third reason, and then a conclusion that talks about what assertions you've made and how they demonstrate the validity of your thesis. Structure is one of the things that I grade for, because part of the purpose of this is practice and training in making an effective argument about history, because that's actually what historians do. Historians, like myself, perform research and leverage that research into academic arguments that attempt to convince people of our particular perspectives and assertions. That's the job that a lot of academics have, including historians. And so make sure that you have a strong introduction, a 3-part body, and a conclusion. The things that I grade for are on the requirements for all papers. And at the bottom of that is a diagram of what I grade for. And of course, you've already seen this with the images essay. The other thing that you want to try to bear in mind as you're wrapping things up, maybe in a paragraph right before the conclusion, is if there's something that someone would say to disagree with you, you want to try to address that so that your potential audience is not thinking about this one thing that undoes your argument the whole time that you've been writing. So if you're writing about a particular work that mostly shows scorn for the gods, but then there's one passage that particularly praises particular god or particular role that the gods play, then you want to talk about how that fits in with your thesis. Because for example, that passage that is praising the gods is pointing out the things that the gods don't normally do, and so is a demonstration of what it is that the gods should be, or something like that. Think about what someone would say if they were going to disagree with you. In terms of doing research, so I try to provide you with some examples of things that you might want to look for. A lot more material is available on the CUNY OneSearch library website, so that's full text digital. The main thing that you want to make sure that you are doing is looking for books, chapters, and articles, and excluding reference entries and all the other things that aren't what you need. If something comes up in a library search, but it's a reference entry, that's a tertiary source. It's like an encyclopedia entry. If something comes up as a book review, that's not a valid source, because a book review is somebody writing about somebody who wrote about something. So you choose books, book chapters, articles. You choose peer-reviewed articles. You choose full text online, and filter by that, and you'll find a great deal of material that wasn't necessarily there a few years ago. If you do have a chance to go to the library in person, it's often helpful, just because a lot of times the book that you need is on the shelf next to the one that came up in your library search. And so that's worth trying to do if you're doing research in general, even if you don't get a chance to do it for this particular paper, because oftentimes the criteria by which things come up in a search isn't necessarily the same thing as what you're looking for. Either way, whether you're looking at something that you pull down off a shelf or that you are reviewing digitally, you have a few shortcuts. You can check the table of contents. You can check the index to see if it's talking about the subject that you're interested in. Otherwise, you can set that book aside. But like I said, look for primary sources or other works by the same author, or works that are contemporary, that cover the same subject. So, for example, if you're talking about the Gnostic Gospel, you can look at other Gospels that give different emphasis to the teachings of Jesus. If you're looking at Birds by Aristophanes, you can look at other Greek plays by Aristophanes, or other plays that feature the kind of attitude toward the gods that you see in Birds, and so forth. Or you can look for secondary sources, scholarly books about your author, or about the period in question, or about the subject that's showing up. And if you have any questions about whether something would be useful, again, come and check me out. If you are looking for additional primary sources alongside the one that you're actually studying, and you want to find especially useful passages, a lot of times those will be flagged in your secondary sources, in your books and articles that talk about the subject. They'll make reference to a particular passage as being particularly relevant to the thing that you're writing about. And so if you're not sure if it's like you have the entirety of the Iliad, which is enormous, or all of Herodotus, Herodotus talks about something and you're not sure exactly where it is in Herodotus, you can skim through your a book chapter or an article on the subject, and the footnotes will point you to the relevant passages. All right. Any questions about the research? All right. So the other thing that I want to talk about briefly is citations. So you want to make sure that all of the information in your essay is correctly cited. And this means that you need to have two things. You need to have a bibliography which lists all of the works that you've used with the information that's necessary for somebody to find that work, which is usually author, year, title, and publisher information. Even if you are using an online source, even if you're using a digital copy, you need to provide the corresponding print information for that book. If you're using a transcription of a primary source on a website or something like that, it will still have come from a book most of the time, and it will have the source information for that particular book, and the year, translator, publisher, and so forth. So this is what needs to be listed in your bibliography. And then any information, any of your evidence that appears in the body of your paper needs to have a footnote or an in-text parenthetical citation. You can do it either way. You can either have a footnote that says, that is using the footnote function at the bottom of the page, or you can have a parenthetical. Either form of citation is fine. I don't care about whether you use Chicago or MLA or anything like that. What matters to me is that all information from your sources is cited, not just direct quotes, but any information that comes from your source material, whether you are paraphrasing a passage in the text that you're using, or if you allude to a moment in the play, or you put forward an idea that appears in one of your secondary sources, whether it's quoted, whether it's paraphrased, whether it's described, whether it's just an idea, it must be cited. A lot of people make the mistake of only citing direct quotes. That's not enough. You must cite anything that doesn't come from you. You must provide a footnote or a parenthetical cite that points to one of the things in your bibliography and adds a page number that says where in that book you can find that information. Yes?
If a primary source is like under a page long, should you cite it by line? Like, should you put name of the source and the line where you're taking the information from? Or should you just put page one?
Yeah, it'll depend on the context that it comes from. So something that is a primary source is one page, but that shows up in a book that's full of primary sources or something like that, will you would give the page number of that book. If it's provided on a website that just gives you, it's still going to be broken up in some way. There's still going to be sections or lines or something like that. So normally you would want to try to have, even if it's a short source, there's going to be some delimiting information that you can provide to help point to the location of the information that you're looking for. And again, if you're not sure about a particular situation, you can touch base with me before you upload your paper, and I'll be happy to help you out. So cite all the information that's not from you, direct quotes, paraphrases, information, statistics, ideas. Everything the paper needs to support your thesis argument. You don't need to provide a whole background of, if you're writing about birds, you don't need to write a whole background of about Athenian comedy or why the birds was written, or a biography of Aristophanes. Your thesis statement is what you need to support. And so your thesis statement should have 3 reasons why it's true, and your body should consist of those 3 reasons. You don't need to provide additional material that doesn't support your thesis. If you're writing about the Gnostic Gospel and it's relevant to talk about why the Gnostic Gospel was written because it supports your thesis, then that makes sense, and you can provide the evidence that backs it up and so forth. But if it doesn't support your thesis, it doesn't need to be in the paper. You don't need to narrate the history for the same reason. You don't need to. You don't need to tell me, the whole story of Greek drama or of if you're doing the pumpkinification of Claudius, you don't need to tell me the whole story of how Claudius died and how the Romans dealt with that. You want to focus on what it is that the story is telling you and what it is that supports the arguments that you're making. Please make sure that you check the requirements for all papers, because they are the requirements for all papers. And that means that they are the requirements for this particular paper. In terms of citing ancient sources, there's a methodology that's slightly different, simply because ancient sources have many different editions. So if you are referring to the Iliad, for example, and you want to refer to a particular passage, it's pretty much useless to refer to a particular page, because a lot of people will have different editions of Homer's Iliad, and the page numbers won't correspond. And so what you want to do is use the standardized book and section numbering that is given to almost all ancient primary sources. And sometimes this will be, if it's a play or an epic poem, it will be book and line number. So something like Iliad is divided up into books, and then within that you would refer to particular lines. But something like Polybius, who writes prose history, you would just refer to the book and the section number. And any good online translation or printed edition of these works will provide this information. If you have an online transcription that doesn't provide this information, you need a better transcription. You need a better version, because you need to use, for any ancient primary source, you need to have this information. You can't just provide the name of the work and then you're done with it. You need to provide the author, the name of the work, and the book, if relevant, and section number. So again, if you're not sure about how that works for a particular work that you're dealing with, just email me and I'll be happy to help you out. Any questions about the research essay or about the proposal feedback or anything like that? Now that I've monotonized you for 10 minutes, your brain waves are all flat, and you have no capacity to ask any questions at all. But seriously, this is a good time, because if you have questions about the research essay, chances are someone else in this room has similar questions. So if you're wondering how to approach something about the research essay, now's a good time to get it.
If a source doesn't have an author, should you just use the title in the footnote?
Source doesn't have an author.
If the primary source, they don't know the author for it. It's just a title for it.
Usually, you would either you'd want to provide like anonymous or unknown as the author name, and you could list it that way in the bibliography, or you can list it under. Sometimes there are certain works that were thought to have been written by a particular ancient author that later scholarship says that it wasn't, and so it will have an author name like pseudo-Xenophon, and so you can still refer to it that way. But you want to anonymous is fine. Any other questions about the research essay? Those of you who have not yet submitted a proposal, you can still do so, just so that I can provide you with some feedback. The due date for this is relatively soon, 3 weeks away. So please make sure to mark out your time to prepare for this paper, as well as to write it, as well as to review it. This is not a night before kind of paper. This is a 5 to 7 page paper in which you are making an argument and supporting it with evidence from multiple sources. And so you need to set aside time to do your research, to read through the work that you're studying, so that you are sure that you're understanding it and what it is that you want to say about it. To do the additional research, to write the paper, and then to sort of let it marinate and come back to it and make sure that it makes sense, that you're making an effective argument before you upload it. All right. Last chance for questions right now. You can hit me up later, but I'm standing here right now, right in front of you. So here's your opportunity. 5, 4, 3. I'm just kidding. All right. So we still got some time. Come to me in office hours and send me emails, and we'll work through it.
For deductible points on the essays, do you want us to just be submitted on Blackboard or email it back to you?
Resubmit on Blackboard is fine. You can email it to me, but better to have it all in one place. So, let's talk about the Greeks. So, last week we had sort of the preliminary foreshadowing. We had the version 1.0 of the Greeks, if you will, the Mycenaean Greeks, who elbowed their way into the Aegean world, and essentially barnstormed their way to dominance over the Minoans, whose infrastructure and economy and economic approach and trading system they admired, emulated, and surpassed. And this built up to a magnificent empire that was then brought crashing down in the complete collapse, not only of the Mycenaean culture, but of the entire Bronze Age. The entire Bronze Age comes crashing down. And a lot of this is incited by the instability, increasing, dangerously unstable nature of the Mycenaean Empire. The Mycenaean Empire was built upon the luxury production of bronze, which I mentioned last week, becomes more and more problematic. It depends upon a wealthy consumer profile and the increasing need to find more and more markets, more and more sources. The result is that a bronze-based manufacturing economy becomes more and more frenetic, more and more out of control. It spins out of bounds like a misloaded washing machine. And this brings it to a crisis point at exactly the same time as the Mycenaeans are doing something else to drain all of their resources, which is what?
Trojan War?
The Trojan War, right? The Trojan War is an all or nothing prospect. A life or death struggle for control over the trading power of the Aegean against the only remaining potential rival, against the powerhouse of the Mycenaean Empire. And the Mycenaean Greeks invest so much in terms of resources and lives and everything else that they end up being completely gutted economically and socially, just at the time when their industrial economy is spinning out of control. And then on top of that, we see the final blow, the influx of a new wave of Indo-European Greeks. So the Mycenaean Greeks had arrived somewhere around 2000, maybe a little later. And then 1,000 years later, we see a second wave of Greeks called the Dorians, who, another migration of an entire nation of people pushing down into the Aegean that completely causes complete upheaval. And all of these things together, pancakes the Mycenaean Greek economy, society, culture, the entire system, the entire Mycenaean world crashes to the ground. The people flee the cities and have to start over. This happens throughout the ancient world. The cascading effect of the collapse of one Bronze Age empire brings about the crash of all the others. The Assyrians and the Hittites and the Egyptians. The entire Bronze Age, all of the Bronze Age powers come crashing down in succession. The Egyptians never recover, never become a power again, always being dominated by others from this point on. The Assyrians take hundreds of years to develop again. The Hittites are gone forever. Hittite civilization never arises again. What happens with the Greeks is that when they flee cities, they return to the countryside and begin to rebuild in farming villages. And this is the period called the Greek Dark Age. This is referred to in the text, and you might or might not have the context for what it is the text was talking about. But the nature of the Greek Dark Age is called this not because it was a bad time. It's not called the Dark Age because the Greeks were covered in shit for 400 years. It's called the Dark Age because it's dark to us. It's called the Dark Age because the Greeks leave behind their urban technologies in order to start over in the countryside with, at first, subsistence farming villages. And writing is an urban technology. So when the Greeks abandon the cities and lose their urban technology, they lose their writing. They no longer have a writing system. And we can't hear them anymore. We don't have any documents. We don't have we don't have any information about what life is like during this time, except for what comes through from when the Greeks recover writing again. So we have this whole period in which the Greeks have no writing, and yet they retain a memory of what things were like before the collapse. How do they do that? Any guesses as to how they maintain that connection? Yeah.
Oral storytelling.
Oral storytelling, in a particularly codified way that becomes a central and, to a certain extent, sacred part of their culture. This is their means of understanding who they are and how they relate to each other, how they relate to the gods. All of this is done through this kind of storytelling. And so this has an effect, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the passage of information across the entire Greek Dark Age is entirely through poetry, through oral literature, and through what else? Through rituals that develop and maintain consistency from generation to generation. All these are things that we can only see once they are already established. The information that we have from the following period, once we can hear the Greeks again, has the key elements of Greek society already firmly ensconced in Greek culture. And this is particularly true of religion. As soon as we get written information again from the Greeks, it's already, the Greek religion as we know it is already fully formed. We already have the way the gods are depicted, the names and stories. We have the means by which they are connected to each other. We have sacrifices and rituals and festivals. All of these things spring fully formed. As if out of nothing. So much so that some later authors give Homer, who is our major piece of evidence from this critical moment, some later authors give Homer credit for inventing all of it. What it actually means is that it's all developed during this crucible period in which the foundations of Greek culture are laid, and we can't see it happen. We can only see the finished result. And so, later on the Persians invade, and we have the climax of Greek culture, what's called the classical period. This is the period that we know the most about, where we get a lot of evidence that isn't Homer. We have a lot of archaeological evidence, we have a lot of literary evidence, we have legal evidence, we have religious evidence, we have all sorts of things, almost all of it from one particular city, Athens, which doesn't represent the rest of the Greeks. And so Athens is so peculiar, so bizarre, so unlike the rest of the Greek cities that, in a way, it's so misleading to have so much information about the Greeks, about the classical Greeks, because 90% of it is talking about what's peculiar, and peculiar is the right word, to Athens, extrapolating to the rest of Hellas. Hellas being the word the Greeks used to describe themselves. Extrapolating to the rest of Hellas is extremely difficult because Athens was so anomalous. Because all of the Greek cities are anomalous. They are incredibly independent and distinct and unique in their identity. And so talking about the Greeks is an interesting exercise because you have to constantly be aware that there are the Greeks, but each of these city-states is unique and separate and unlike the others. Much more so than other city-state cultures that we've seen, like Sumer and Assyria and Egypt. The independent, autonomous, culturally distinct nature of the Greek polis is off the charts compared to other city-states, and that has a big effect in how we talk about Greece.
Did the Dark Age extend throughout the whole Mediterranean and Fertile Crescent? Like, in all those places, is there also a 400-year gap in writing?
No, because what happens is that, for example, in Syria and Canaan, the Phoenicians developed their own writing system, and so that spreads to the Hebrews and then to the Assyrians. The Egyptians never lose their writing because they don't have to flee the cities. All of their habitations are along the Nile, and so they maintain hieroglyphics in Coptic. The delay here is because the Aegean is on the fringes of the civilized world, and so it takes a long time for them to begin trading with other Mediterranean peoples. And when they started to do that, they come in contact with the Phoenicians and acquire their alphabet. So this is a particularly Greek thing. Eventually, the Greeks are conquered by the Macedonians, and you can take the History of Ancient Greece course and find out more about that. And the result of that is a Hellenistic world in which Greek ideas are spread to the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean and become part of the foundation for what we call Western culture. And so a lot of what we're talking about in terms of Greek ideas and Greek perceptions of the gods is familiar to us because it diffused through the rest of civilization, was absorbed by the Romans and becomes part of European and West Asian history. So, what we have with Homer is the emergence of an author that describes a particular moment. Homer is writing down stories that have been passed from generation to generation, but is preserving the nature of society in the moment in which he's writing. So it provides information both about Homer's time at the end of the Dark Age and about the period that it's writing about from the collapse of the Bronze Age 400, 500 years before. But Homer is writing for a reason. Homer is writing the Iliad and the Odyssey in order to... Homer is writing the Iliad and the Odyssey for a particular purpose, which is that as the Greeks recovered, they were angry about how their ancestors had squandered their civilization, and they determined to build a new society that was that rejected the greed and ambition of the Mycenaeans. And Homer is a product of that. Homer is writing to vilify the Mycenaean Greeks. If you read Iliad and Odyssey, the Greeks are the bad guys. Agamemnon is full of pride and lust for the trophies of war. Achilles is so consumed by hubris that he sulks in his tent while his protege Patroclus fights his battles for him and is killed. Odysseus is so enamored of his own intellect that the gods elect to punish him with a wandering home journey that lasts for an entire decade. The story of the Iliad and the Odyssey is a story of what happens when people have power and crave more. When people have ambition and need and make it the driving force of their society. That's a very quick visit. The fabric of the story uses the gods to reinforce that point. The way that the gods behave in Iliad and Odyssey involves one of two things. Either it involves their connections with each other, the divine system that Homer has set up, that links all the gods in relations to each other. Or it involves the gods being offended by the destructive behavior of the Greeks and bringing about punishments that result in cataclysmic events for Greek wrongdoers and their families. That result in woe that comes from the gods as a response to things that Greeks did that were destructive to their society. Agamemnon is punished, and his family is punished, his descendants are punished because of his selfish behavior, which is destructive to the community. Achilles is punished because of his excessive behavior, which is destructive to the Greek cause. Odysseus is punished because of his hubris, which is destructive to the rest of the Greeks. The Trojans are depicted as being the paragons of morality, as being the contrasting means of performance of a society. Hector is the most noble character in the Iliad, and so in terms of religion, the role that the gods play is intimately involved in each other and in the doings of humans that affects the divine world, because it affects the human society. The gods relate to humans, relate to mortal society by the things that people do to reinforce a strong community, by being selfless, or to damage their community by being arrogant or proud or ambitious. The gods are invested in a strong and stable community and act against those who damage that. Now, the thing about Homer is that Homer becomes the basis for Greek society and Greek culture. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey disseminates through the entire Aegean and is read by all Greek-speaking peoples and becomes the foundation for what it means to be Greek. It becomes the way in which young men and women are introduced to the Greek language and to Greek writing. It becomes the way in which people understand how you relate to somebody from another city, or how wars are fought, or how the drainage of a city will happen, or the architecture of buildings. The Iliad and the Odyssey are so comprehensive that everything that you need to know about society is in its pages, and most of all, the understanding of the gods that the Greeks have comes from Homer. The understanding of the gods that the Greeks have is invested in the stories of Iliad and Odyssey. And so they see the gods as these characters that have sometimes ridiculous stories, that interact with each other in capricious ways, but that respond angrily to people who damage the human community. The epic poetry of Homer is designed as a literary construct to reinforce the importance of marriage and community against selfishness, the importance of marriage and community and it's extremely successful in doing so. And the gods are presented in relation to that end. Homer contains, I forgot I had bullet points on this. Homer contains everything about Greek religion. It involves something else, which is, because it's designed to speak to as wide an audience as possible. The Homer that has that we have, it was written down somewhere in the 8th, 7th century. The Homer that we have is a deliberate generalization of Greek religion as it existed in Homer's time. It removes any local ideas, local rituals, local epithets, local traditions about particular gods. It creates a generalized understanding of the Greek gods and how they behave that is pan-Hellenic, that applies to all the Greeks. And so Homer is influential in shaping Greek society, and to some extent that means that the Homeric version to the gods helps to shape rituals and stories and festivals in some communities. But the main thing that it means is that Homer is out of sync with actual religious practice because it's generalized and homogenized. It's not a guide to how things were practiced in individual cities. It's a guide to what can be spoken about in common about the overall pan-Hellenic perception of the gods. So Hesiod is another writer that comes along about a generation later. Hesiod helps to complete this process of homogenizing the gods across all these very different Greek cities for the purposes of literature. He writes a book called Theogony, which contains a very elaborate system of divine information and helps to solidify a divine world that's separated from the humans. Local Greek religious practice was more in tune with particular gods being important in particular cities, and those gods would be thought of as being local and as having visited those cities and potentially even walking amongst them and having particular affection for one place versus another, having particular sanctuaries. This is local practice, but in Homer and Hesiod, there's a strong effort made to reinforce the connections that the gods have to each other in order to emphasize the separateness of that divine world, to have the gods in another place relating to each other in terms of the things that they've done with each other in stories and the way that they are related to each other in I guess you'd normally say blood. It's weird to talk about the blood of the gods, but the way that they're connected to each other by marriage and parentage and so forth creates a structure that is set apart from the human world, that makes the gods a little bit more alien, a little bit more a concern with their own affairs. And so their judgment when they respond to the Greeks in Homer and Hesiod, in literary works, is specifically about provocations that force them to act amongst the humans. So what am I saying? I'm saying that there is a literary foundation for how the Greeks think about the gods, which is alongside mundane religious practice in festivals and sacrifices and local practice of everyday religion. So I mentioned before that because we have this period called the Dark Age in which we don't have any evidence. It seems to spring forth fully formed in Homer and Hesiod, but we do. It's obviously brewing from the intervening period. Last time we talked about the Bronze Age and how there's some evidence of a connection. Anybody remember what connections we were talking about in terms of familiar elements of the Mycenaean religion? It was mainly in terms of names that were familiar, right?
Oh, the way they were spelled was very similar, and then I remember you were saying how Dionysus was the weird one because it was imported from the East.
Right.
And it was just differences in spelling, basically.
Right, and so we have certain gods that are definitely of Indo-European origin. And Zeus is the obvious example of this. So Zeus is there from the Indo-Europeans and is there for the Mycenaean Greeks and is there in classical Greek society. But his role is not exactly the same, right? Because remember we said that the chief god, who's the chief god of the Mycenaeans?
Sky god?
No, you would think that because it is later Poseidon, probably because of Minoan influence. Poseidon is the chief god of the Mycenaeans. So we have some Mycenaean influence, but what seems to come through is some names and functions, but other Mycenaean gods that we know from Linear B don't survive. They only exist for the Mycenaeans, and other gods that the classical Greeks have, the Mycenaeans don't seem to know about. So there's some transmission of names and powers for very few gods, mostly Zeus. But even the role that Zeus has is different. The real crucible, the real development takes place during the Dark Age. During the Dark Age, we have stories that start to form that are passed down through performance of epic poetry. So, in each generation, you have the stories of the past and the stories of the gods being performed orally to the accompaniment of a lyre. And you have professional storytellers called rhapsodes whose job it is to tell of the relations between the humans and gods. At first, one of the things that's striking about the Greek Dark Age is that it starts out as simple subsistence, simple survival. But the Greeks develop and grow so quickly and so effectively that the result is there's a population boom. And the cultures begin to develop in terms of numbers and in terms of economic power, even before we can see them. The last century of the Dark Age is a time of immense growth And we see this not only in terms of the economy, in terms of luxury goods being produced again, in terms of the development of new communities and these farming villages merging together into new kinds of Greek cities called polis. We see all of this economic development. We also see religious development. We also see huge upsurge in the building of shrines and temples and sanctuaries and sacred figures. And the information that we have suggests that it's so sudden a burst that we can probably assume that for things like temples and sanctuaries and dedications and things like this, that there's probably a preceding period in which more perishable versions were probably built, mud and brick versions of these temples that are replaced by marble and stone versions that we're able to document during this 8th century Renaissance. These temples that are being built, moreover, are being built as monumental centers of a community. They're being built as showpieces that demonstrate not only the relationship with the patron god of the city and the other gods that are given temples, but also also the pride and power of the city itself. And so the reacquisition of writing happens during this time of immense growth. It's part of this Renaissance. It's part of the way in which Greek culture is experiencing a huge explosion of power and confidence during this last century of the Dark Age, the 8th century. So the book talks about heroes a little bit. The nature of a hero is a little bit interesting because it comes into how we were discussing mythology and how blurry the lines of mythology are. So how do we define a hero? What is a hero to the Greeks? How do we describe a hero? Yeah.
Someone who goes through some kind of journey, someone who goes through a journey but has a personal development. They change in some kind of way.
Okay, so the hero is somebody who has a story told about them that involves a kind of change or transformation. And the result of this is that there is a cultic presence for that human, for that mortal, in succeeding generations. Not that they're worshipped, but that they have a presence in a persistent presence in the culture of that community. Is that a question?
They face also fierce challenges.
Right, so they're facing challenges. They represent, the overcoming in some way, and in some way that parallels changing for a community. Yeah.
They often represent specific virtues that the religion or culture values.
Right.
As people.
Right, and often something that provides a transformation. So this is Theseus, who is a cultic figure for the Athenians because he's a human hero that achieved transformation for himself that also had an effect on his community. Jason is another example of somebody who has stories told about him that overcomes this transition, which results in a cultic presence in his home city, which is Corinth. And so this points us toward another aspect that is critical with heroes, which is that heroes are local. This is a local element to to the Greek understanding of the relationship with the divine. These heroes are understood to be an exception to what usually happens in death. What did you guys pick up in terms of how the Greeks think about death? What do the Greeks expect to happen normally when you die? You have you transition, you pass over the river Styx, and then you enter the realm of Hades, which is a place of dolorous lack of experience. You don't expect much to happen. You don't interact with your ancestors in the living world. It's a place where the spirits persist, but that are cut off in this indeterminate place where they can't accomplish anything. They simply exist. The heroes seem to be some kind of exception to that. But what's interesting is it's not exactly clear. It's not necessarily the case that the heroes become demigods, or that they are alive in the divine world. It's not necessarily their spirit that persists in the cultic practices that remember them. It may be that it's the resonance of their lives that was exceptional enough to persist into later generations. So this is something that's a little bit unclear when the Greeks talk about heroes. Is it their lives that persist, or is it their spirits in death that become exceptions to the normal understanding of death for the Greeks? The other thing that this plays into is how we're talking about mythology and the way that, our chapter on mythology was sort of saying that it's misleading to talk about mythology and legend and so forth, because these are our perceptions. The fact is that the Greeks have stories about Zeus, and they have stories about Agamemnon, and they have stories about Theseus, and all of these people belong to a mythic, legendary past that provides, that helped to shape the world that people live in, and that provide models or counterexamples of how to live that guide people in ordinary society. These stories exist as the basis for how humans treat each other, and that's just as much true for mythology about Zeus and legends about Theseus and Jason. They are both, made of the same stuff. They're both the way that the Greek people collectively think about their origins and their gods in literary terms. So what we know about the actual practice of religion is mostly in terms of what we have from Athens. So there's a single patron deity that has many sacred sites. So or many sacred sites for additional gods. In addition to, so, for example, this is Athens. Athena has not one but two temples on the Acropolis. But there's also a temple of Zeus behind it, and in the Agora there's a pillar of the 12 gods and a sanctuary of Zeus Soter, and there's a temple of Hephaestion just off of the Agora. The city is full of places that are dedicated to the particular gods they invite among them. There's a schedule of sacrifices and festivals that involves the population. The festivals are actually the key thing to think about in terms of how the Greeks relate to the gods in everyday life. The Greeks relate to the gods in everyday life in terms of communal opportunities for shared behavior. And so these festivals might be processional, or they might involve a particular set of activities, but the point is that they are communal, that the people of Athens relate to the gods collectively. And one of the reasons for this, and perhaps the most important aspect of Greek religion, is that the Greeks have no priestly class. They have no religious infrastructure. And so the result of that is that the way that the Greeks relate to the gods is through the community. They're not told what the gods are thinking by self-interested priests who are protecting their own power. There isn't a class of people whose job it is to stand between the gods and the people. The people understand the gods as relating directly to them as a community. They own themselves what the gods are in the form of literature. There's no sacred text. There's no embodiments of ritual words or anything like that. The nature of how the Greeks understand the gods is something that they all share, and it's something that belongs to them. The literature of the Iliad and the Odyssey and other works like it that provide the basis for not only their understanding of the gods, but their collective ownership of that understanding. And this means that the gods act how the Greeks need them to act. All right, so I'm out of time. I'll finish talking about the Greeks next time, and mystery cults, and then we'll move on to, I think, the Etruscans. So make sure to do the readings for next week, because I will catch up to where I'm supposed to be. In terms of the reading for this week, for the death of Patroclus, think about what I was just talking about in terms of how the purposes that the gods serve in Greek literature, and how they are enmeshed in human affairs. The reasons for that, the ways in which that intermeshment shows, and the motivation for it, what this is telling us about how what the Greeks need their gods to be, and what the death of Patroclus represents in terms of Greek culture as well as the gods. So I'll chime in and discuss that with you, and have a good week. I'll see you next time.